They introduced some corporate legislation, and under this, around 1,100 private companies, as you say, were exempt from filing financial statements to ASIC if they were founded before 1995.
There's a lack of understanding, perhaps, between what is an entitlement and then what's a privilege and a benefit, say, that employees enjoy.
Well, we've been to Auckland and Wellington. Now we travel to Christchurch to assess the health of its economy.
I think every business should have an obsession with profitability. Shareholders put money in and they deserve a return. So we are listed like the Australian banks are listed. So we do need to be mindful that we're using shareholders' capital and they expect a return.
The willingness to think long term, I think, that was evident both in Ireland and in Copenhagen.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, the veil has been lifted on the finances of Australia's richest people, and there may even be some Kiwis among them. Co-editor Hamish McNichol and Australia correspondent Lachlan Colquhoun take a look.
The private business affairs of society's richest people are often difficult to track down and access by journalists and investigators. But in Australia, a veil of secrecy over some of these activities has recently been lifted after a long-standing exemption for large private companies was finally overturned. This means that around 1,100 private companies which were previously exempt now have to file financial returns to the corporate regulator, ASIC. NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Colquhoun is covering the issue in his Underarm column this week and joins me now. Lachlan, how did this exemption come about in the first place and who was exempt?
So, Hamish, the exemption dates back to the days of the Keating government in the 1990s. They introduced some corporate legislation, and under this, around 1,100 private companies, as you say, were exempt from filing financial statements to ASIC if they were founded before 1995. It's called a grandfathering clause. So this comprised a large number of companies used by some of Australia's richest people, Kerry Stokes, the Packers, and even former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who in a previous life was a very wealthy investment banker. So if you had founded a company after 1995, you had to file with ASIC, and keen-eyed journalists could access these statements, but it created a whole class of what was called dark companies, and these were largely old money companies that had been around for quite some time.
Why did it take so long to lift the exemption?
Well, Hamish, it was never intended that it would be that they would be exempt forever. But the Howard government, which followed the Keating government, continued the exemption. Labor was then elected in 2007, and that government under Kevin Rudd legislated to reverse the exemption, but they were booted out of government before they could do so. And then the Abbott government came in under Tony Abbott, the Liberal government, and they were obviously subjected to some very intense lobbying because they continued the exemption. And they reportedly that was because people said that exposing their private business could lead them to being kidnapped, which is not something that happens often in Australia. But the Abbott government were convinced by this, and they continued the exemption. But more recently, there was a Green Senator by the name of Rex Patrick, and he was a transparency crusader for government and corporate transparency. He moved a motion in the Senate to overturn the exemption, and this was finally passed possibly about 2 years ago with Labor support. So now these financial results are trickling through.
So now that it is lifted, has anything significant come to light?
So the exemption only covers filings from the 2023 financial year. So anything prior to that, it's not retrospective. So we only know a few of these filings as they're starting to come through now. Also, the criteria for a large proprietary company changed in 2019. So companies have to have 2 or 3 criteria. They have to have revenues of $50 million or more, assets of 25 million or more, or 100 employees or more. So that's catching a few of these companies. We know, for example, that Kerry Stokes, who Kiwis might know as a media baron, also owns a lot of mining interests. He has a personal wealth of $11 billion. He set up his private company more than 40 years ago, and this is the first time he's had to file to ASIC. That showed a pre-tax profit for 2023 of 107 million Australian dollars. Lindsay Fox, Kiwis might know the Phillip Island MotoGP circuit for the motorcycling GP. He also owns Avalon Airport, which is Melbourne's second airport. His company made a $23 million profit on revenues of $39 million and was able to distribute a dividend of $3 million. But I'd also make a point that there has been a bit of a lag, which has given a lot of these companies the opportunity to restructure before the disclosures became mandatory. So we may not be getting a really true picture. A lot of the companies would have taken some steps, I would imagine, to hide or obscure their activities. So we're only going to get a picture from 2023 going ahead under the restructuring that a lot of the companies are going through now.
Might there be any implications for New Zealand here too, do you think?
I've been very much pondering this. So I think that there must be a number of NBR listers who have private companies in Australia. I mean, some of the wealthiest Kiwis, as we know, they've built major trans-Tasman businesses. We won't know what happened in the past. I mean, Ron Briley, for example, may have had some private companies that he created a long time ago, prior 1995. We won't be able to get to those. But going ahead, if there are any NBR listers who have active companies, private companies in Australia that meet that criteria, they will definitely have to file to ASIC, and we're certainly going to be looking very closely and to see what we might see going forward. So there might be a little bit more transparency in our list results going forward, and I can certainly hope so.
This week's Dollars and Cents heads to Christchurch after a recent Business Canterbury survey revealed renewed optimism about the local economy. Here's a panel to discuss commerce in the Garden City. Well, we've been to Auckland and Wellington. Now we travel to Christchurch to assess the health of its economy. Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents. I'm Jonathan Mitchell. To debate, Business Canterbury Chief Executive Leanne Watson, City Councillor Sam McDonald and property developer Vinnie Holloway. Vinnie, first to you, how's business in Christchurch at the moment?
It's actually quite positive, Jono. Like, to give you an idea, in 2022 and 23, and now I can obviously only speak for house sales, and that's new house sales, which we do as a company. But in 22 and 23, we sold exactly the same amount of houses, which was about 90, just on 90 houses. And this year, which is interesting, it just goes to show like it was a very steady market, although not as extremely positive as some people would hope. It was very steady. And now we're in September and we're tracking to be at about 110 for the year sales. So just is picking up quite a bit, which is good. It's not like it's booming. And the other thing that we've noticed is there's a huge proportion of our purchases since sort of 21 have been owner-occupiers, around about 80% of them. But of those, we have about a third of them are from out of town moving to Christchurch. I'd like to say it's because the houses are great, but I actually think it's mostly to do with the fact people can have quite a great lifestyle here, similar job opportunities to Auckland and Wellington in terms of, big companies and government agencies and that sort of thing, but and plenty to do in the weekends and good schools to send the kids, but also extremely affordable compared to, say, Auckland and Wellington.
So, Vinnie, are you starting to feel the relief from lower inflation?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we definitely are. And we're even starting to see, and I'm just talking from a sales point of view, starting to see quite a few investors coming back into the market just because they can see, on the horizon that the interest rates are coming down a bit and they can, they can make a new investment property work in terms of actually being able to afford to hold on to it with rent and costs being more closely aligned than they were, say, 2 years ago.
Leanne, to you, how is general business confidence in Christchurch, Canterbury?
So look, it's definitely showed, I guess, renewed optimism over the last quarterly Canterbury Business Survey that Business Canterbury runs, which was really pleasing to see. Now, the survey opened just days following the first interest rate cut, obviously in 4.5 years, so that may certainly have had something to do with it, but it's certainly a welcome sign for the business community and our local economy. So quite a large improvement in expectations for both the Canterbury economy, but also individual business performance. And I think, obviously what Vinnie's just talked about is probably a good indication of that. So a really big turnaround from our last survey in May. So really, really pleasing to see, and early indications that the recent drop in inflation and interest rates are certainly having a positive impact on the business operating environment, despite it still being pretty challenging for businesses out there, and what has felt like a real sort of elastic band economy over the last few years. But certainly, renewed sense of optimism. with a little bit of cautious optimism, I guess, as well, just around things like investment potential, etc. So some of that has just been a little bit tempered by concerns around consumer confidence and demand, which is still pretty slow, and that's still one of the top concerns for business in our last survey.
How would you summarise current conditions then?
Look, I think current conditions, it does depend a little bit on what sector you are in, but current conditions remain still pretty challenging. And I think, we've all heard the term survive to 25. I think there are definitely businesses who just sort of battening down the hatches a little bit. They're not yet looking at, investing in their own businesses, plant, equipment, machinery, hiring more people yet. But there is that sense of things are going to get better in the foreseeable future, but they're just being very cautious at the moment. So things we're still talking to businesses a lot about increased costs. We're talking to them about compliance costs, cutting red tape at both a local government level and a central government level. We've had early engagement with the Ministry for Regulation, for example, to highlight some of those challenges that businesses face. That is just continues to add more costs. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but we've got a little way to go. But overall, I think in Christchurch and Canterbury, businesses are feeling pretty optimistic. Really interesting that Vinny talked about the number of people coming from out of Christchurch to buy houses in Christchurch. We've had the highest internal migration now for the second year running. So Christchurch, people are moving here in droves, and I think there's a number of reasons for that Vinny's articulated already.
Yeah, so are there the jobs available?
Yeah, absolutely there are. And actually some really interesting jobs as well. Christchurch is now a really different city. There's a bit of a saying we have here in Christchurch: if you haven't been to Christchurch in the last 3 years, you haven't been to Christchurch. We've got new and emerging sectors like aerospace. We've got some amazing high-tech and innovative companies that are doing some pretty neat stuff down here. So there are really great career opportunities in Christchurch. There's a bit of a myth that if you want a big career, you go outside of Christchurch. That is no longer the case. And we're seeing that. We've got record high enrolments at the University of Canterbury here as well. And, again, that's another indication that, people are coming to Christchurch because of all of the things, a great quality of life, great career opportunities. That the affordability is something very real. The average median house price in Canterbury is $680K versus $795 in Wellington and over $1 million in Auckland. So add that to the quality of life, the fact that we've got no congestion, and it's just an easy place to get around. It's a pretty compelling picture.
Let's bring you in, Sam. What are the council's priorities to support businesses at the moment?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of things. I think firstly is honouring our commitments around large infrastructure. So if you think about Te Kaha, for example, our immediate focus is ensuring that's delivered on time and on budget, which it is at the moment. April 26, we should have that open, which will be a massive economic stimulus to the city. Look, the second thing is actually just doing the basics well. So if you think about our infrastructure relative to, say, Wellington Council, it's very important that we do what we're paid to do. And so we've really focused our capital programs around delivering that. And I think, as Leanne has mentioned, obviously that regulatory impact as well, which is how do we make it easier for businesses to operate, but actually businesses to develop. And I have to say, with the change in government, there's been a real change in focus and actually more pragmatism and doing things easier. And I think that culture change from Wellington will embed itself within local government as well, and certainly make it easier for us to push for change.
What about these projects, these legacy projects from the quake? Are they going to come online in the next few years as well?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, Te Kaha is obviously a significant one, which we need to get completed. Metro Sports, or Parakiori, which is actually being run by the government. So I think a lot of people think that council are delivering that. We're not. We had a fixed contribution to it and government pick up the tab. That's been delayed for years, I think largely because of the contract structure. So it's really important that gets online. But then you think about other things like the Court Theatre, where we've put a significant amount of money so that can be completed. We've effectively honoured all of our commitments in terms of that blueprint that was set out by the government. And so, as the Mayor says, Christchurch is really coming into its own now. And as Leanne mentioned, it really is a different city, and we've honoured those commitments. So, look, I think our next challenge is really helping minimise that regulatory impact so that people can do well in Christchurch and we don't put up barriers.
And that full video is available now to watch on nbr.co.nz. Stop working from home. Recently, Public Service Minister Nicola Willis called to cut the number of public servants working from home. This week, Charlotte Joy of BE Employment Law gives us the legal take on the pros and cons of flexible working arrangements.
The issue of flexible or hybrid working has been raised again following a directive from Public Service Minister Nicola Willis last week to reduce the number of public servants working from home. Willis said the government wants to see more public servants come into their workplace each day and that working from home is not an entitlement and must be agreed and monitored. The PSA hit back, claiming the government's axing of thousands of public service jobs are what's hammering Wellington's economy, not working from home. Joining me now to discuss the legal ins and outs of flexible working is Charlotte Joy, a Senior Associate at BE Employment Law. Welcome, Charlotte.
Good morning.
So what's the legal point of view? Is Willis right? Working from home is not an entitlement?
She's right in that the Employment Relations Act does not provide a legal entitlement to work from home, but there very well could be a legal entitlement as contained in the contract.
So the PSA in response to the Minister directive was that many public servants have flexible working built into their employment agreements. So that just can't be disregarded, can it?
That's right. So if there is a term in an employment agreement, you do need consent from both parties to vary that, and usually that needs to be in writing.
The PSA also made the point that workers have made decisions around their family life and, based on these agreements, certainly since COVID. So it's become an expectation, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's where it becomes difficult. There's a lack of understanding perhaps between what is an entitlement and then what's a privilege and a benefit, say, that employees enjoy. So can definitely understand the frustration there from individuals who have lived or worked in a specific place for a particular reason.
There's actually, under the Employment Relations Act, I understand there is a sort of clause that deals with flexible working requests. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so it's not been well used over time, but there is a framework in place where an employee can make a request for flexibility, whether that be in location or hours, start time, finish times, whether that's a temporary or a permanent thing. And an employer has to respond to that in a particular way, and there's a very discrete number of reasons that they can push back on a request like that.
But at the end of the day, you can, an employer can say no to working from home, can't it? It has that right.
That's right. And often a lot of individuals don't necessarily want the permanent working from home arrangement or flexibility, but it's often that ad hoc request that can be tricky. I've got a tradie coming in on Thursday, can I work from home? The law doesn't account for that at all.
What do you see as the pros and cons of working from home?
For the employer's side, there are some challenges with having people work from home, depending on the role. So where there aren't set KPIs or targets or work that someone has to do, it can be quite difficult to monitor the quality and the output of work. Another challenge we've seen from employers is managing absenteeism and also mental health issues. It's sometimes really hard to get a gauge on those issues when someone is working from home. But there are also a lot of pros, and I think that employees do feel a sense of trust from their employer when they're able to work from home, and it gives them perhaps more job satisfaction if they're then able to prove themselves and work more independently. So it's a fine line.
For a lot of people, it's getting out of Auckland's gridlock, in particular in Auckland, isn't it?
That's right.
A Randstad survey last year found 81.9% of Kiwi workers consider flexibility of working hours important. Do you think this is sort of more a thing that younger people want, or is there an age sort of link to this at all?
I'm on two minds. On one side, there is a lot of young people who have entered the workforce during COVID, and so that's what they're used to. So they haven't really had another way of working. But on the other side, we do see a lot of older people who have young children or school-age children who want to do the pickups and drop-offs, or the ones who have moved out of the hustle and bustle of CBD out to Titirangi and, want that flexibility. So I can see it from all ages interested.
There's a recent ERA case which deals with this issue. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so there was an interesting case where a worker had in her employment agreement that she was to work at a particular branch of a financial service provider, but throughout her whole employment she'd actually largely worked from home, despite her contract not saying that. The employer then tried to make her return to work, essentially without consultation. Understandably, she raised concerns around that and ultimately was restructured out of the business.
So what was the finding of the ERA?
So they found that despite her essentially working from home most days, it wasn't a term of her employment, hadn't become that. But the employer should have consulted with her before requiring her to return to work. So she was successful in part of her claim there and got some compensation, but also ultimately her dismissal for redundancy was upheld because they did have a strong business case and followed a fair process to make her redundant.
So is there any sort of lessons for other employers out of that?
Consult, talk to your people, understand the issues, but also if you're requiring a change, do get their feedback and consider that before making a decision. But redundancy can be an option at the end of the day if you have an actual business reason for requiring people to be in the office and fair process is followed.
So it seems to me that at the moment, we've got a high unemployment and employers have got the upper hand, as it were, the power, so they can probably force people. But is that a good way to sort of go about forcing people back into work if you want them to?
Not if they want the best out of their people. There was a time where a lot of people were talking about people being present in the job but not really being present in the job, if you know what I mean. And I think there is a risk of that if employees become dissatisfied. And ultimately, recruitment processes are expensive and difficult, and employers don't really want to have to do that more than they have to.
And of course, this pendulum always swings too, doesn't it? We typically have a skills shortage in New Zealand, don't we?
That's right. And it also swings in terms of times of year where people naturally look for other work. So if someone's being forced back, at the end of the year, just before Christmas, they may well look for other employment in the new year.
How do you think employers should look at this when they're dealing with people? Do you think it needs to be written into contracts more then?
There's pros and cons of that kind of approach. I think if it's in the contract, it is clear, but then also circumstances can change, and sometimes it's more difficult then to change that in future. So I think policies, that's the same with policies, pros and cons, but I think employers really need to understand the issues their people are facing and really understand their perspective, because if people are on board, it's a lot easier to get change through.
An obsession with profitability. That's what long-serving Heartland Group Chief Executive Jeff Greenslade says every business needs to succeed. Now enjoying the first few days of his retirement, he reflects on his 15 years with the group. With us now is outgoing Heartland Group Chief Executive Jeff Greenslade. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. So why exit now?
I've been Chief Executive of the group in its various manifestations since 2009. So I've been there for a reasonable period of time, been through a lot of change. And I really felt that once we completed our strategy for Australia, it was a good time to move on.
Okay, what kept you in that role all those years?
The change, the excitement. We had a lot of activity. We started off, when I first started in 2009 with the PGC group, which was via Merit, was where we aimed to become a bank. And then we had the GFC, so we were in survival mode, and then we merged with two building societies. So that was another interesting exercise. Then when we became a bank, we had to decide what sort of bank we wanted to be, because we couldn't see the future in being like all the other banks. A small bank trying to muscle out the major banks was never going to work. So we came up with a best or only strategy, and then to find products where we could command a leading position and higher margins. That then led through to the reverse mortgages, and that brought with it Australia. So there's been a lot of activity along the way. So all those things were constant sort of change and challenges, which I found very stimulating. So even though I was there for a long period of time, the nature of the job continuously changed, and that's what appeals to me.
What's it like leading a bank in New Zealand?
Well, I was leading the bank for most of that period, and then later we were required with Australia to change the structure, so I led the listed company. Leading a bank in New Zealand is very challenging if you're small. You really do struggle to find your relevance relative to the major banks who've got such a major share of all banking activity. So for us, we decided to go down a path of being different. Rather than being a small version of a big bank, we decided to embark upon a separate pathway. And that suited us because we, unlike all the other banks in New Zealand, we're listed. So we have shareholders that quite rightly demand a return. So we had to do something different.
And has that been to your success?
Yes. So if you look at when we started, when we put ourselves together, we had around about 1.7 billion of assets. The group has around about 7 billion of assets, and our profitability was around about 7 million. And last year we clocked in around about underlying profit around about 100 million. So we have, in a financial sense, we have expanded and grown and been successful. But also, I think socially we have achieved some great goals as well. We have pioneered reverse mortgages in New Zealand, and we are the leading provider in Australia, which provides, in both countries, the same sort of demographic pressures apply, where you've got that generation that are asset rich and income poor, and being able to get some equity out of their house is a very beneficial way of managing retirement.
Why is there such a fascination with banks and profitability?
I think every business should have an obsession with profitability. Shareholders put money in and they deserve a return. So we are listed like the Australian banks are listed. So we do need to be mindful that we're using shareholders' capital and they expect a return. I think also, in a broader sense, having a profitable bank sector is very important in terms of economic resilience. And in many ways, New Zealand has been very fortunate with the Australian banks in that we've been through the GFC and also, I guess, the post-COVID economic pressures, and we've got a very strong banking sector. And one of the reasons why it is strong is because it's profitable.
So can you describe what excessive profit is or not?
No, it's an interesting question. I don't think it's a question. The issue facing the banking sector in New Zealand is less around excessive profit. It's more around, I think, choice. We have the Australian banks that provide, a great service. There's no question about that. And as for the reasons I mentioned, we're fortunate to have them. But they do have a very dominant position in terms of their share of the total banking activity. And I think, the discussions that are underway in terms of trying to create more choice for consumers, I think that's really the relevant conversation. And then, what that means in terms of profitability remains to be seen. But it's important to have a profitable banking sector because it keeps it strong. It keeps people investing capital and development and so forth. So, and like all businesses, if they aren't profitable, then people will then shy away from it. But I think the interesting debate for the future is how do we create more mobility between banks in New Zealand? I mean, I'm a great fan that, like we've done with the telecommunications sector, where you can take your number with you. I think transportability of bank account numbers would facilitate more choice, more consumer choice. Because it's like when you change your bank accounts. It's an ordeal of going through all the automatic payments and everything that you've got to sort of think about in terms of change. So I think that would be a great step forward. I'm also very much in favour of Kiwibank becoming the champion New Zealand bank. I think that's a great objective for the country to have a very strong mainstream bank because we're not a mainstream bank. But having a very strong, large mainstream bank that's locally owned, I think that's an important objective as well.
You've touched on it, but what are some of your highs?
Some of my highs, I think, the best or only strategy, is probably at the heart of the things that I found most rewarding, and that was a difficult strategy to come up with because it seemed very much counterintuitive. It was about jettisoning a lot of what the products that people think that are core to a bank, like, for example, transactional banking. We couldn't do that because we just didn't have scale, couldn't compete with the major banks. Residential mortgages until recently, until the advent of digitalisation, we couldn't do. And so having to make those decisions were quite tough, but ultimately very rewarding, and we delivered a better margin as a result. I think the reverse mortgage strategy, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, very rewarding, and that sets us apart from other banks in Australia and New Zealand in the sense that, for example, at the moment, we're still getting very high levels of growth because it's not impacted by the economic environment. And I think, becoming a bank in Australia would be a highlight. And then there's other things. One of the things I'm particularly proud of is our Manawa Ako strategy, which was to provide an internship initially for rangatea Māori and expanded it to include Pacifica. So every summer we bring in 30 interns who get to see what it's like to work in a bank, and that's been very rewarding also. And as a result, a lot of them have come back and now work for us.
Finally, this week, the National Chair of Buddle Finlay, Jennifer Caldwell, thinks New Zealand can learn from Ireland about how to plan and pay for infrastructure. Political editor Brent Edwards with this.
National Chair of Buddle Finlay, Jennifer Caldwell, thinks New Zealand could learn something from Ireland about planning, funding and building infrastructure. What can we learn from Ireland in terms of the way they deal with infrastructure, in terms of planning, financing?
A lot. It was an action-packed 5 or 6 day trip, half of which was spent in the Republic, mostly in Dublin, and also a day in Belfast, and then we went on to Copenhagen after that. But Ireland, I guess, is fascinating because of its sort of similar size to New Zealand, not just in terms of population, but also geographical size. They do have some advantages, I suppose you'd say, that we don't have. They're in Europe for a start, in the European community, and they're proximate to Europe, so they've got access to a really highly mobile population of skilled workers. They've also got one of the highest tertiary education rates in the OECD, and because they've been smart over a long period, they've got really good sovereign wealth, which they're putting into infrastructure development as well as traditional government funding. They've had the advantage of a lot of European regulation in terms of drinking water standards, for example, which is effectively forcing them to grapple with things like drinking water quality and fresh water quality at a European community level, and is forcing them to invest in those things. And of course, we don't have those sorts of external motivations for some of those things.
So have they, because of that though, then have they planned the renewal and the maintenance of infrastructure better than we have in New Zealand?
In some areas. I mean, just to take water for an example, I know water is very topical here, of course. One of the presentations that we heard on the delegation was from Irish Water. And it was fascinating because while we are going down a path of emphasising local control of water and water service delivery, they've gone the other way and they've centralised everything, and that happened within the last 10 years, effectively. So whereas all the water networks were owned and operated by local councils, the control of all of that and the responsibility for maintenance and upgrade is all now with central government.
Which was essentially the kind of model that the previous Labor government was heading toward. Yeah.
That's right. The interesting things there, though, are, and some of these lessons, it was interesting to me, some of these lessons are things perhaps what not to do rather than things to do. But for the water example, The one thing they haven't been able to successfully implement is user charging. So they had a user charging regime set up, and then it sort of lost political support in 2016. So although every home in Ireland has a water meter in it, they were never able to get the charging regime set up because of public backlash and opposition. And they've also got the problem that it's an old water system and there's a lot of leakage. Dublin alone, I think, has 33% leakage from the system. So they've got a lot of maintenance issues, and they've also got an inability to curb demand with the use of financial incentives. So, quite a tall order in terms of things to deal with. They've also figured out that climate change for Ireland means that the western side of the country will be wetter than the eastern side over the coming decades. But because of this difficulty with maintenance and no ability to curb demand, they're having to build a big water pipeline that brings water up from Shannon in the south. And so that's a major piece of infrastructure that's going through the planning and consenting process at the moment. But it's a good example of what can happen if you haven't got the right commitment to maintenance of infrastructure assets over time, and also if you can't control demand.
And do they feel that their water facilities would be in better condition if they'd managed to put in user charges, water charges?
I don't think that question was put to them, but it would certainly mean a lower bill. I mean, they're investing significant amounts of money in the upgrade of the water network. And that would have just been another, it would have given them a little bit more flexibility, I guess, in terms of funding, cost recovery and so on.
So where's the money coming from? Because obviously in New Zealand the issue of financing and funding it's a big issue.
So for water it's all coming from central government. I think most of it. I think when I was just looking back over my notes, I think 80% of it is funded by central government. Now maybe there's a European component to the rest of it. I can't recall that we got into that sort of detail.
What about the overall infrastructure pipeline then, roads and other infrastructure, energy and the like? Do they have a clear infrastructure pipeline where it's set about what's coming on stream? And
yeah, so the really fascinating thing for me, because my field is resource management in the infrastructure space, so effectively consenting and implementing infrastructure projects. But there's a couple of strands to this. One is the National Planning Framework in Ireland, which has just gone through a big review. It's a 10-year framework, and similar to what we have here, and actually it's a 30-year framework. It cascades from the top down. So there's a national framework which sets policy on key issues such as where growth is to be concentrated, and what the key infrastructure needs are in those areas. And then it cascades down to more of a regional and local planning framework. So we have something reasonably similar here with the RMA and the statutory plans that fall out of the RMA. We have national level direction with the national policy statements, then we have a regional policy statements and regional plans in each of the regions, and then each local or district council has its own land use plan. But in Ireland, that's matched. That national planning framework is matched with a national development fund, basically. So the priority commitments in terms of land use and infrastructure planning that are in the planning framework are then matched with, at the moment, a 10-year fund of 165 billion euro, which
and that's what is that central government money or?
A lot of that is coming. Well, it is largely central government money. Yes, I mean there are some projects which have PPPs involved in them. For example, there's also the Irish Strategic Investment Fund, which is used to be a sovereign wealth fund, and it's been sort of repurposed post GFC to be a sovereign development fund. And so they have their own program of work which fits in nicely to this pre-identified pipeline, if you like. And the pipeline then matches the planning framework. So if you look at the planning framework, which includes a spatial component, which is another thing we're missing here, the plan will tell you where the priority infrastructure projects are to meet growth forecasts and so on. And then you've got the funding which lines up with that.
So is that the key thing that we can learn then from the Irish experience, the way they seem to integrate infrastructure need, planning and funding? It's all kind of coordinated.
In terms of a plan, yes. Now, obviously, we didn't get into a lot of detail about where different projects are getting their funds from, but we do know, for example, that the greatest private sector participation is in things like housing and education. I mean, for example, a lot of new housing development in Ireland is funded by North American real estate investment trusts, for example. Not so much public sector funding in transportation. So there have been some PPPs in the past. I think what we were told was that there's currently 12 or 13 operating PPP concessions in Ireland, and some of those are in transport. But at the moment, the big transport projects on the horizon, such as the Dublin Metro to the airport link, is going to be a PPP model.
So any other key messages or lessons from Ireland?
Just the willingness to think long term, I think. That was evident both in Ireland and in Copenhagen, where we spent the final 2 days of the delegation. The commitment to long-term planning and regardless of changes in the political landscape, the strategic, the Irish Development Fund, for example, is that's the arm of the government which is tasked with procuring inbound direct foreign investment. They were set up 80 years ago, so they've got huge experience in attracting offshore investment to Ireland. That's what's been behind the progressive approach to corporate tax, immigration policy settings, the commitment to tertiary education, which was made free in the 90s, for example. They know what attracts the big multinational entities, and they've adjusted policy settings to make that an attractive option. So they've now got these centres of excellence where they've got biotech companies all clustered together, healthcare tech, for example, media entities, and so on. It's been an incredible. It was really interesting just seeing the sophistication of that approach honed over many decades. And one of the delegates with us from KPMG was offering that the Irish model's been successfully implemented in Queensland. So there are other places around the world where that type of approach has been developed.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join Mike McRoberts from 5 p.m. tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. See you next week.